Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Pastor Jeff Gallagher. I'm here at Trinity Baptist Church in Sherwood Park, way up in Canada. Hey, most of you know me, but this is an online study, of course, and so it goes kind of out there to the internet everywhere. So wherever you're watching from here today, whether you're a regular or new, welcome to all of you. This is about a 25-minute study or so that we typically do on Tuesday nights. And just full disclosure here, today, like I usually do, I pre-recorded this, but our council, our church board is meeting on Tuesday nights. So I'm going to let the video play while I'm attentive there at our board meeting. So feel free to say hi to each other, especially if you're watching this on our Facebook stream, where you can kind of say hello and all that. And I will catch up with you later, especially if you have any comments or any questions. Today, we are looking at the final vice in a sermon series and a book study that we did during Lent. We couldn't get to everything during Lent, so last week and now this week, we're finishing off a couple more of the topics that we didn't quite get to. The book that we were using was this book. I've got it on my Kobo here, called Glittering Vices, from a lady named Rebecca DeYoung. And it's basically a modern look at the classic seven deadly sins. Now, she doesn't call them those. She calls them the seven capital vices. And you can refer to previous episodes for an explanation on that. But for me, I think of these things using some word pictures. To think of a capital vice is to think of something that happens up at a headwater, like in a mountain range, up in a watershed, where if things are polluted up there, everything downstream from there is going to be really gross. So instead of just trying to clean up the river downstream, we got to get up to the headwaters, like these capital vices. Another way of thinking about these is that these aren't just sins that you kind of overtly commit in a particular day. These are more like things that have worn a groove into your mind or into your habits. And so they're a lot harder to dislodge, but there's worth in doing that, again, because of that downstream effect it'll have when you clean up the watershed. But I think we also want to admit, and this is something we've talked about throughout this series, is that vices are, well, like I said, they're hard to dislodge. And when you become a Christian, yes, we're saved by God's grace. We are continually sustained by God's grace. But there's not usually many magic shortcuts to Christian maturity. There's a lot of faithfulness and commitment required to walk footstep by footstep in the way of Jesus and being transformed by Him through the Spirit over a lifetime. And so we've had some good times with this, but our last vice that we're looking at here today is the vice of lust. Yeah, I saved the best for last, maybe. Maybe you're thinking right away, oh no, I'm going to get out of here. I don't want to watch this. Let me just give a few disclaimers. Lust is not just a thing that guys struggle with. And that's typically where things go when we talk about this, guys and pornography. But hey, let's admit it. Many women, they love their steamy romance novels, whether you buy it at a secondhand store or in the airport lounge before you get on a flight. A lot of people, especially women, seem to really get into the 50 Shades of Grey movie series. And of course, hey, guys have their objects of affection, but gals like their Brad Pitt or their Mark Wahlberg, or if you kind of go back a generation, maybe that Sean Connery figure. So let's just admit that lust is something that both men and women struggle with. Let's also admit, too, that this is not just a young person's game either. Statistics will show that there is a high degree of sexual activity among seniors. And I know for myself, as a young guy, way back in the day when I watched, I think it was the movie Grumpy Old Men. That was a movie that opened my eyes to the realization that grandpas have raging hormones. Anyway, so when we get into lust here, let's make sure we're narrowing this definition down, because often we use the word lust for things that are more general, like if a person has a lust for power, which really has to do with excess. Tonight, we're just going to focus upon sexual temptation. So please just hang in there. This might be a little bit uncomfortable, but it is something worth examining in our lives so that we can be more and more like Jesus. I'm going to give you two more encouragements too as we enter into this. And these are just kind of, I guess, pastoral encouragements for you. First of all, let's even the playing field here. I mean, all of us, to some degree, have experienced sexual brokenness in our lives. None of us are unscathed in this way. And I don't mean that as a discouragement, I actually mean that as an encouragement. It's not like there's people out there who are just doing fine. We're all struggling in some way sexually, or at least we have at many times in our lives. Secondly, this vice, and I guess I'm saying this with a lot of sympathy, this vice almost always begins with weakness, not with malice. So you can imagine there's some of the other vices that we've talked about here. They could just be done by really mean people. But this vice begins often in moments of weakness where we're not very proud of those things. So I say those things again, just so it feels like you're not so scared of walking into this. All right. Well, where do we go from here? Well, usually I like to just remind us of some of the biblical data that we could draw from. We could look at the whole overarching story of Scripture, and we can recognize right at the beginning the goodness of physical creation that we see in Genesis when God created the world, God created humans, including their bodies and including sex. So the goodness of sex is something that we need to remind ourselves of. And I'll probably say that at the very end too. Of course, there's a whole lot of examples throughout Scripture. It's really hard for me to even pick many, but there's so many instances of people expressing brokenness in their sexuality throughout Scripture. There are some amazing, beautiful portraits of really good and healthy sexuality, and we see that, for example, in Song of Songs, an Old Testament book that we usually don't preach from. We try and shield the teenagers' eyes from those too, because it's pretty racy stuff. But anyway, but I guess I would say, looking at all that biblical data together, we would definitely, as Christians, believe that God created both the soul and the body, and that both of them are God's idea. And it's not like the body is bad and gross, so who cares what we do with it, or the other kind of way that we deal with it sometimes is just to punish it. That's not good. The body was made by God, just as our spirits were. Um, and so, because there's this union of body and soul, we should not treat sex as a mere animal instinct thing, but nor should we treat it as something where divine ecstasy is somehow involved, like some New Age kind of groups might do. So, sex is not intrinsically sinful, but it's not going to save anyone either. We could say a lot more biblically about lust, but maybe I'll just kind of plead with you that we're kind of speaking to the choir here about this one. But let's look a little bit at church history and some of the teaching and some of the things that have kind of come out over 2,000 years since Scripture. I think it was old church father Saint Augustine from about the late third or fourth century or so. He was saying this famous quote: "God, grant me chastity, but not yet." Which I think is hilarious. But anyway, but you could go through the whole of church history and you could see, of course, Christianity has a long legacy of celibacy in monks and nuns and all of that, and it's mixed. There's actually some pretty cool stories there, but there's also some degradation of the body, or thinking too lowly of the body and too highly just of spiritual things. And of course, you don't have to look very far, even within our own time, to see a lot of sexual abuse and other horrible headlines that we see all throughout church history. And again, like I say, just around us. And it's horrible when you see church pastors and other famous evangelists and others kind of fall from grace that way. But I think we can look for some of the good too. So, for example, in seminary, I did a paper on the theology and the practice of marital sex throughout certain phases of church history. I can tell you, the research was never boring. But when I looked at it all, I think there is something there to really reclaim and to celebrate. There's a disciplined dignity within marital sex that we can champion, and it's wonderful. I can say all that. I can write a great paper about it, but hey, let's face facts. Whether you're young or you're old, whether you're married or not, lust remains. It's one of these, of the seven vices. This is another one of those hot-blooded ones. Wrath is kind of hot-blooded. Gluttony can be to an extent too, but I think the way that lust and gluttony also kind of kind of relate to each other is both of them look for quick comfort. But let's remind ourselves that these vices, these sins, uh, they don't have an independent life or existence of their own. They can really only borrow from God's original intent, from God's original design of things, and steal the oxygen from them or twist them around and that sort of thing. So, how does lust do that? So maybe I wouldn't necessarily call this a definition thing, but some kind of ways of describing lust. Lust is a matter of taking for oneself rather than mutual self-giving, which is what God originally intended. Lust is physical pleasure without the constraints of relational intimacy and, of course, accompanying commitment. Lust is, again, it's physical, but without recognizing the full humanity of the other person. Do they even have a last name? And so, in that regards, lust really gets down into fantasy, not even into reality. If you read the chapter, if you end up reading the chapter here on lust from Rebecca DeYoung, she quotes an anonymous pastor here, I think, and I just want to read this for you. This is about how lust dehumanizes. So, lust dehumanizes the other. In fact, lust needs to dehumanize the other. Lust doesn't work when the other person is fully human. That's why exotic dancers always have fake stage names. You would never have a dancer use her real name. Why not? Well, because that gets in the way of objectification that lust needs. A man leering at an exotic dancer doesn't want to know her real name. A great way to empty out those clubs would be to stand up before the dancer was about to come on and say, "This is Sultry Susan, but her real name is Mary Walensky. She has 4 brothers and sisters. Her parents divorced when she was 5. Her mother is an alcoholic. She's been married twice. Her last husband beat her. She has 2 kids and is struggling to get by. She likes dogs and would love to be a dental hygienist someday." That would empty out the room. An introduction like that would short circuit the lust because it would put intimacy and humanity back into the picture. Lust doesn't want the full humanity of the person with her needs and her vulnerabilities. Lust wants low lights, a haze of alcohol, and lots of lies. I love that quote and that example of what lust is like. And perhaps one more thing. Lust leaves quickly. It doesn't stick around. And I mean that because it kind of comes and goes in our own heads and hearts, but also when it's acted out upon, it leaves quickly. It doesn't stay for the commitment. It just goes out the door, sneaks out and goes back to work. Um, so what are the dangers of lust? Something we'll talk about in a bit is about consent. So I want to skip that for a bit. But when we think about lust as a vice that can wear down the grooves, into a groove in our lives, what's the danger in it in particular? Well, I think one obvious thing is the shame and the self-loathing that we can do to ourselves. And even though we try and stay close to other people that we know, there's a distance that we can feel and a distance that we try to pretend isn't there. But there's shame and loathing and distance, depression. Those things can all be a result of this. A second big thing, and I really was just hammering home on this with this great example here, is the degradation of others and actually also of ourselves. But let's focus on others. Um, I know one of the really popular pop singers right now is Ed Sheeran, and he's got this famous song called "Shape of You." And one of the lines in it goes, "I'm in love with the shape of you, da 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 da. I'm in love with your body," which to me thinks, no, actually that's the wrong word for it. You're in lust with the person's body, and again, we're degrading a person into an it, into an object of lust, and it devalues that person, but I think it also devalues other people whom you don't find sexually attractive. Because if your eyes get trained to think lustfully, you will look at people who don't have sex appeal as being people who are not as worthy of your attention. whether they be, well, maybe I won't pick on particular people groups, but I think you know what I mean. People whom you would have no sexual appeal for, to you are just kind of not worth your time. But let's also return to the thought of degradation, that it affects us too when we give into lust over and over and over again. We turn into something that we wouldn't want to really become when we're honest with ourselves, because there's this addictive quality though to lust, that it just sucks us in again and again and again. And there's a law of diminishing returns to lust too. So you can't go back to the same old website or the same old whatever for years upon years and just think that you're going to get, the same old thrills. Uh, the same old thrills don't thrill you anymore. And so then you have to get darker and deeper and more habitual into it. And yeah, that addictive quality, it degrades us. We turn into people whom we would have never wanted to. I think if you go down far enough with that, you get into some extreme defensiveness too. And I've often thought this as a pastor, that if I really want to tick someone off, I just need to challenge them about their sex life, and how it's maybe not adhering to biblical standards. Whoa, get ready for the blowback, right? But that's what happens when people give into lust over years and years and years. I'm a pretty gentle guy when I try and confront people, but extreme defensiveness and accusations of meddling can come back. When I'm really not trying to get too much into people's business, I'm just trying to get them to follow Jesus as they claim to. Anyway, enough about me in those situations. That's not really what I mean by that. But boy, lust can do some damage to us. So, saying all that, let's flip it around a little bit. How do we correct this with God's help? Of course, this is not something we want to just try and work harder at and stuff. Well, let me return to that consent comment that I made just a few minutes ago. I think consent is far too low of a bar. Now, of course, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with consent per se at a societal level. It's a lot better than non-consent, of course, right? But it's just not enough. It's just too low of a bar, and it's very short-sighted because it believes that you can have two rather siloed people give consent to each other and do whatever they're going to do, as if these two people live in siloed existences, but they don't. They have all these webs of connections and relationships with that will be affected so often. I could rail on that for a long time, but let's keep going. So one corrective truth for us to think about here is to reclaim and to celebrate the original goodness of God's design. So let's remember that biblically speaking, our sexual desires and our actions are part of what it means to be a holistic human. God designed us to have these, but we need them to be disciplined well. But we have both body and soul. We're embodied souls, or maybe to say it differently, we're ensouled bodies. So Rebecca DeYoung, the author of this book, she asks a great question. How should our sexual desires serve our full humanness? Maybe I'll kind of add my own twist. How should our sexual desires serve our full biblical humanness? That's kind of a thinker question for you to sit with, wrestle with long term for your own self, and how you'll work that out. One thing I think I want to say is that we also need to reclaim the gift of singleness and of virginity. I think in our Protestant circles, we view singleness and we view virginity as, especially lifelong virginity, as a bit of a tragedy. And that's too bad, because I think those of us who are married know that once you're married, it doesn't magically fix lust. Um, Lust can afflict all kinds of people, married, singles, everyone, right? So there's a gift, though, to being married, of course. There's a vocation there, but there's also a gift of singleness and virginity that is not a tragic thing to feel sorry for with people. Um, we can honor that, so that people don't feel all sorry for themselves when they're single. Uh, let's also, when we're thinking about corrective truth, let's kind of go a little different direction, and let's acknowledge that pleasure, and I'm here thinking of sexual pleasure, it's best enjoyed indirectly while you're pursuing something greater than mere pleasure, and that would be, of course, real intimacy. I mean, lust promises pleasure without intimacy, but it's like it turns out to be like an undercooked cake. You know, it's tantalizingly good on the outside, at least that's the way it looks, but you bite into it and it's raw and it's very unsatisfying on the inside. But when you pursue an intimacy first and you enjoy pleasure as a byproduct, I mean, then intimacy is like the cake and pleasure is like the icing on the cake. I could say all of that when it comes to corrective thinking or truth, but I think the bottom line that we need to acknowledge on lust is it really comes down to a question for us about our pride. You might remember from one of the first sermons in this series that some Christian theologians over the centuries have thought that of all the vices, pride is kind of the root of them all. Some agree with that, some don't. But in this case, pride seems to really be there when it comes to lust. The question is, do I trust God's good intent for me and his way, or will I do things my way? Kind of goes back to the Garden of Eden in a little bit of a sense that way, right? Will I take the forbidden fruit? Do I trust God's good intent for me and his way, or will I just do things my own way? I'll leave that with you. Some applications for you. I know we're running out of time already. There's a lot more we could talk about, but here's some applications. First of all, real practically speaking, there are accountability tools which are available. There are some actually really excellent online tools for accountability. I'm doing that with a person right now and helping them. Done that before many times in the past. Talk to me confidentially if you would like some information about that, maybe even some accountability. I'd be honored to help you with that. But if you don't want to go to a pastor, there are small groups that you can find in our church. Um, you can find an accountability friend, maybe from our church or from elsewhere, who the two of you can have these kind of conversations and check in with each other and keep each other sharp and on the right track. Um, I think it's also really good from an application standpoint for you when you think about yourself and lust to study yourself, to know when you are most susceptible. You are likely susceptible to fall into lust when you feel really empty inside, or when you feel really hurt about something and you're feeling sorry for yourself, or if you are totally stressed out and you just feel like you need some release, or when you're tired and your guard is down, or especially when you feel lonely. So study yourself, know when you are most susceptible so that you can plan accordingly with a counterattack. And maybe this is where we kind of want to go to end it because, when it comes to lust, it seems like it's all about playing defense all the time. But I know there's like those sports analogies, the best way defense wins championships, right? That's kind of what they say. Well, that's not really what we're thinking about here when it comes to lust. You can't play defense all the time. You got to go on the offense and fill your life up with good and amazing things that God provides for you. So, for example, because we're body and soul psychosomatic wholes, let's start with the spiritual side of things. You can and should develop and maintain good and deep spiritual disciplines where you, again, using the word intimacy, we're anchoring ourselves in God's love for us. On the body side of things, it's really good for you to pursue good and engaging activities that involve your body. Um, so lust can be something that actually really academic people can really struggle with because they live in their head all the time and they haven't learned to do anything productive and engaging with their body. So exercise, whatever you want to do with that. Exercise can be good. Visual art, musical art, whatever you need to do that way to engage your body so that you're more aware of kind of your sensory experience as a human. This that full humanity stuff we were talking about before. So good and deep spiritual disciplines for your spirit, good and engaging bodily activities, of course, for your body. And of course, relationally, there's nothing like having some great friendships, deep friendships that you have, and hopefully friendships with both genders as well, so that you don't see the other as something just to be suspect about and always on guard around. But good friendships. Great. Well, we could talk about a lot more. I'm sure some of you might want to know, like, what does Jeff think about the Mike Pence rule? If you ever heard of that, you can always check those questions, and I'll get to those as I've said before. Thanks for hanging in there. It's a sensitive topic, of course, one that has for all of us many stories attached to it, personal stories. Um, but this concludes our journey through these seven glittering vices from this book from Rebecca DeYoung. And so thanks for being a part of that. Thank you for all your input on what we'll talk about next. And so I'm going to go out on a limb here and I'm going to tell you right now, next week, next Tuesday, we are going to start probably what will be a long journey through the New Testament book of Revelation. Many of you were asking about that at different times in the last number of weeks, and I might be biting off more than I can chew, but we're going to go for it. So it'll be a good journey that we'll have together. So again, if you haven't said hi on Facebook, feel free to type in something there and say hello to the other people who are watching. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time. Hopefully we'll see you at church here online this coming Sunday, or perhaps even in person. All right. Have a good week, everyone. Bye-bye.